Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of this guy, right? Jeremy Bentham and the following Benthamites, right? We talked about this dude, his mummified head, and how, of course, it was stolen as a university prank multiple different times throughout class the other day. But the big thing that we need to understand is we are now picking up on this guy, Edwin Chadwick, and this concept called the miasmatic theory, right? So what we're going to be focusing on in this last flip leading up to your test is going to be on the things where we're talking about institutional responses to all of the problems that were set up by the Industrial Revolution. And what I mean by institutional responses, I'm basically talking about in and of itself how governments and cities will then react to, all right, the problems that are actually coming up. And of course that includes no plumbing in these major cities. It includes, of course, germ theory being a very, very important piece. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the Second Industrial Revolution. But I'm going to clip in an old flip that I did last year that's really, really solid, talking about all of that stuff. And then I'll be back here in about 2 seconds to talk about one more thing, the Second Industrial Revolution, right? So I'll see you in a sec. Benthamites. And probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous Benthamite, is of course this guy that we looked at in class as one of the best hairlines that history has ever seen. His name is Edwin Chadwick, right? Edwin Chadwick is an English government official charged with pauper relief, okay? He actually worked on this same exact council before 1848 with Jeremy Bentham, right? While the rest of the continent is going through all these little baby revolutions, Edwin Chadwick is working with Jeremy Bentham, trying to figure out what they're going to do about pauper relief, right? But then after Jeremy Bentham dies and passes away and has his body mummified and stuff like that, Edwin Chadwick is left on one of these pauper commissions. Now, when working for the Parliament as a Benthamite, he does help create the Poor Laws of 1834. Now, the Poor Laws of 1834 do include things like ending outdoor relief, right? So, basically ending that thing that we talked about where, Katie Scuderi can run up and be like, I haven't eaten in days, and they just give her a piece of bread and she runs away out in the streets, right? Making actually more so along the lines that poorhouses are basically turned into prisons. But the thing about it, though, when we're looking at it is those laws were pretty jacked up and pretty messed up, but they're very classical liberal laws, right? They're a very classical liberal law in the sense of they aren't a socialist law. Socialists would have been like, oh no, give them food if they need it, whatever, right? Classical liberals would have been like, no, let's make working seem better and being poor seem awful, right? But the thing about it, though, is Edwin Chadwick, as a Benthamite, though, did contribute majorly to European history in one huge significant way, and a lot of it has to do with waste disposal. When I say waste disposal, I don't mean trash pickup and stuff like that, which in my neighborhood happens on Tuesdays. I mean more along the lines of getting rid of all that duty that is in the streets, right? So yeah, as we talked about in the last flip and stuff like that and in the last class, there's a lot of human waste lying around in these cities, right? The back-to-back housing and lack of plumbing systems and stuff like that is going to lead to an overflow of fecal matter and human waste and stuff like that in the streets of these cities, okay? So the key goal that Edwin Chadwick comes into the Pauper Relief Commission with is we need to figure out a way to ward off disease, right? Because the death of a wage earner in a family can basically destroy their ability to stay viable in the economy and prevent them from becoming paupers themselves, right? So the big thing he wanted to figure out is how do we get rid of all this nasty smelling stuff? Because the thing you need to understand about Edwin Chadwick is he was one of the proponents of this idea called miasmatic theory, okay? So Edwin Chadwick, like Jeremy Bentham and many of the social scientists that came before him, believed in this idea known as miasma or miasmatic theory, where basically they thought bad smells was what actually originated diseases, right? So they also were like, oh, well, poor people get sick way more often, and all their neighborhoods smell terrible. So it must be something about this smell, right? That the noxious fumes of being poor cause disease. Now, the thing about it is he was wrong. Miasmatic theory / spontaneous generation or whatever is not correct. But the thing about it, though, in general, is what he tried to do to overturn miasma is still going to be very, very helpful, right? So what he wanted to do was get all that stuff out of the streets, right? And so he actually advocated for the idea of sewage systems, right? So this right here, he was like, removing waste will be 1/20th of the cost of the way that we do it now if we move all waste removal underground, right? So this right here is not one of his sewers. This right here is an ancient Roman sewer. Why do I always bring this up? To just show you that, look, the ancient Romans, shout out Miss Urso, right? The Latin kids in the house, okay? The big thing about it is the ancient Romans figured out how to
have a sewer dump into the ocean rather than it dumping into the Thames and causing a massive amount of waste and sewage throughout, like running through your freshwater river, right? So the thing about it is, though, is these are Chadwick's sewers, actually. They're a modernized version of it, right? They are curved along the edges, and they use subway tiles and iron pipes to remove the waste from these poorer neighborhoods. Because Chadwick came along and said, look, iron pipes and tiles are cheap. What is not cheap is paying people to go around with wagons and mules and scoop literal human feces into wagons that also might end up being dumped in the Thames and causing even more issues, right? The thing about it, though, is also he's doing all this along the lines of just believing that bad smells are going to cause people to get sick, which is so funny to me, right? So cholera is going to break out after some of his early commissions. His report actually said, we need to get rid of this stuff. We need to get rid of this stuff. And people didn't listen to him for a little while. And then a cholera outbreak happens in 1846. Right? And when the cholera broke out in Britain and then also in other parts of Europe, there were massive amounts of death tolls. Now, what cholera is an infection you get from infected water. Now, this infection in particular wants to get out of your body so it can infect more water, so what ends up happening to you is you end up going to the bathroom until you die, right? So, like, it's a lot like amoebic dysentery, but it's a different illness, right? So his report, though, after the cholera outbreak, became basis for health law in 1848. These ideas spread all over the continent. Sewage systems begin to be dug, right? They double down on it. They're like, maybe Chadwick is right. They start digging sewers, lining them with subway tiles, using iron pipes to try and get all this waste out of these cities and as far away as possible. And when sewage systems were built, look at this graph right here. As sewage systems were built, death rates began to decline, right? Why did they do this? Because things are just more sanitary now, right? So now another big thing is going to come along, though, is as we're digging these different pipe sewage systems and all these different things are happening, and people are beginning to look at cities and begin to be like, maybe we had this all wrong. Maybe cities are designed incorrectly, and we need to actually do this in a little bit of a different way and in a little bit more of a positive way. And the best example of this new urban redesign is going to be in none other than France, under the new rulership of their president, Napoleon III, right? Napoleon III comes along, Louis Napoleon, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, comes along and says, you know what we could do? I am in the wake currently of the Revolution of 1848. A lot of crazy stuff went down, right? I'm now president because of it, but also during the June days, I'd shoot like 10,000 people, right? What can I do to earn the respect of the poor and the classical liberals and the middle class, okay, like classical liberals, aka middle class, the socialists and the workers? What can I do to re-earn their respect? I need to create something that will not only give them a more beautiful place to live in, but will also give them work, right? So Napoleon embarks on the idea of creating a revitalized France, right? A revitalized France based off of Paris. So he actually wants to create public projects that will be used to aid and employ the poor. He's like, look, let's build more roads. Poor people need work. Poor people can build roads. Roads get built. Bang, bang, bang. Roads benefit the classical liberals because their product can now be moved easier over the roads. Roads get they start selling more items, more taxation, more utilitarianism, right? So he wants to create this early form of basically a welfare state, right? Creating jobs directly to benefit the people from government-funded programs. And so what does he want to do, though? The problem is that Napoleon doesn't have any experience as an architect. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know how to design roads so they make sense or where to put these sewage pipes and stuff like that. So he hires a very important figure, a man by the name of Baron Georges Haussmann, right? So yeah, Georges Haussmann is actually half French, half German. He's actually descendant of the area known as Alsace-Lorraine, right? So like now, the thing about it is he is a government official hired by Napoleon III to remake France, right? Remake France, rebuild particularly the city of Paris. After the June days and after the shootings and after the barricades that were built all over the place, rebuild this city as a pristine example for other Europeans to copy, right? So he was employed creating the Paris that you know now, right? So the big thing about it that you have to understand is that Paris was very gross. And this right here is Baron de Haussmann, the man himself, in a very good photograph. That right there is what Paris looked like before the Haussmann reforms. Look how crammed together the buildings are. Look how small and narrow the roadways and alleyways were. This is like a canal that literally the only way to cross it is this little footbridge right here. And also this little waterway is probably filled with human waste, right? Look at the buildings on either side of it. This is another big reason why the revolutions of 1848 were so successful, because you can build a barricade over that very, very easily, right? Also, this is a slum on the outside of Paris and stuff like that. That right there is a picture of the June days. Look at those barricades built across these narrow streets and stuff like that. Cobblestones everywhere that don't make any sense. Haussmann comes along and says, no, We will build grand boulevards that are massive, interstate commerce like ideas to move product quickly and easily, and also give people tree-lined streets to walk by as they're on their way to work, right? Invoke the idea of beauty and serenity and commerce and beautiful pastel equal level buildings all over their fair cities, right? And the other big thing about it too is like when you're Napoleon III, you can march your army down these big old roads for giant military parades, and good luck building a barricade that's that friggin' long. That's another little kind of thing about an ulterior motive that Napoleon III had with this whole thing. If the streets are too wide, can't make a barricade, can't have any revolutions like that ever again. So the thing about it though is they rebuild all these cities in this style, and they create these gorgeous pastel colored fronted cities. And this literally is like the model for European cities now completely. Most cities in Europe have a strict area or a strict number of floors that they can build up to, and most of the buildings are all exactly that height and have these gorgeous, gorgeous pastel fronts. And this right here is the Paris of today, right? With its giant boulevards, its tree-lined streets, its parks and public places, and all these different other ideas, and it's, of course, gorgeous Ring Boulevard, right? So that all is actually related to the Baron de Haussmann reforms. He rebuilt all these things. He destroyed those old buildings to create huge, broad, street-lined, big tree-lined streets that created better flow, demolished slums, and he also knocked down these really old, medieval fortress walls. So, for a long time in the Middle Ages, most cities had a wall that actually went around the exterior of it. This is actually related really interesting to the history of New Orleans due to the fact that New Orleans actually originally had a wall that went around it because they actually used that old medieval idea. And that's why Rampart Street is actually up at the top of the French Quarter, because that's where the wall used to be, because Rampart means wall in French. But the thing about it though is after all that, Baron de Haussmann comes along and realizes that having buildings or having walls around your city doesn't really make any much sense and kind of chokes off commerce and stuff like that. He actually has those walls knocked down and creates these really beautiful ring boulevards that can be used to travel the cities much more effectively and much more easy. And that right there is called the La Pétale, and it literally went around the internal area of Paris, and you can still travel on it today, which is absolutely wild, right? So also he wanted to create parks, open areas, sewers, aqueduct systems to bring in fresh water, public transportation, which is huge, by horse carts early. But by 1890, start breaking out electric streetcars, bananas. All right, so the thing that you need to understand, though, is that Haussmann created the cities in France.
Very nice job, Mr. Terry, from last year. But now we're going to pick up talking about this other thing that we need to know about, known as the Second Industrial Revolution. The thing that for some reason the College Board always wants me to talk about right after the First Industrial Revolution, but I'm not going to talk about stuff that happened after 1848 before I talk about the revolutions of 1848, because that just doesn't make any friggin' sense if you ask me. But what you need to understand, bookending this entire unit together, is that there was a First Industrial Revolution that really catalyzed all of the events that we talked about in this unit, right? It changed governments, it changed representation, it changed the volume of revolutions that could actually happen within Europe. But then there was a second industrial revolution that actually took place from about 1848, right off the heels of those revolutions, up until 1914, when World War I will begin, right? And the thing that we need to understand, though, is that what the second industrial revolution is the burst of industrial creativity and technological innovations that promoted strong economic growth towards the end of the 1800s, right? So in the first industrial revolution, you had a massive change in how things were produced, right? Going from making things by hand in the putting out system to going to making them in an actual factory setup, right? Creating those things inside of factories using steam power, using steam engines, using the coal and iron that Britain had access to actually create, especially in the textile industry, but not just limited to that, many new products in a very efficient way, right? But what's going to happen in the later part of the 1800s is this thing called the Second Industrial Revolution, where you're going to see the growth of transportation, you're going to see the growth of communication, you're going to see the growth of interchangeable parts, you're going to see the growth of how to process new goods that are going to dramatically affect things going forward, and it's going to lead to things like the growth of imperialism, right? And we'll talk about that in the next unit, right? Imperialism is one of my favorite things to discuss, and man alive, it's some really intense stuff, right? But going into it, we need to understand that one of the biggest things is those smaller interchangeable parts, right? New machines are not going to be as very large and archaic anymore in the late 1800s. They're actually going to have smaller gears and cogs and things that can actually be replaced as they break, right? And then also you're going to see the development of electricity, right? And we're going to actually talk about that here in about 2 seconds, talk about Michael Faraday and his creation of this thing called the dynamo, right? Now, another big thing that's going to come along, though, in the late 1800s is this little newfangled device that was invented by a man named Samuel Morse, right? An American man, known as the telegraph, right? Then he also invented the code that goes along with this, all right? And it's known as Morse code, right? This little thing actually would cause interruptions in an electric wire, causing a tone to be put out of a speaker on the other end, right? And you know what it sounds like. It sounds like this, like dee 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 dee, and then the other person on the other end is transcribing those beeps from the Morse code and writing down the entire message, right? Telegraph lines would be laid like in the late 1800s, and one of the most promising ones was actually one that was laid all the way from New York City in the United States of America all the way to London, right? It was the transatlantic telegraph wire, right? They literally took one wire and laid it over the entirety of the Atlantic Ocean so you could send a message from New York City to London, right? And I like the telegraph wire being a really, really great example of just what you can do in the second industrial revolution, the leap forward, the new fine tuning of that industrial revolution, right? And another big one that's going to come along as well is this thing known as the processing of rubber, right? So now some of you don't realize this, and that's completely fine, right? And I'm happy to be the one that teaches you this. Rubber comes from a plant, y'all. Rubber comes from trees and vines, right? There are rubber vines that grow in Africa, and there are rubber trees that grow in Asia. And what they realized during this time period is that you can distillate that sap that comes out of those plants, and you can make this stuff called rubber, right? And rubber is going to be really good early on for adding to factory machines to keep them from breaking down as fast, but then also it's going to be super important as well later on when automobiles start really, really picking up steam, and well, not steam, they're going to use gas, but like the big thing about it, they're going to like start picking up a lot of steam, but the tires necessary for automobiles are going to necessitate a large demand for rubber, right? Then you're going to also see petroleum distillation, which is going to mean the idea of like finding crude oil underground and then like distilling it in large towers so you can actually create things like gasoline, right? Which is going to be very, very important. The internal combustion engine is going to come along. That's going to drive forward the growth of the automobile industry. Railroad transportation, steamboats are going to become important because we're not going to just use them to move coal and iron anymore. We're now going to start using railroads to move people, right? And so like in the transportation around different areas is going to be massively important. Relating back to the Haussmann reforms, right? Streetcar trolleys are going to be very important. So, like street lighting is going to be very, very important. And then you're also going to see this thing known as the Bessemer process in the production of steel. Now, several of these things were actually developed inside of Germany, which is going to scare Great Britain a lot going into World War I because they don't like the fact that the Germans are on their heels and showing up with new, like, fangled ideas, right? And now there's some other people that are actually involved in the Second Industrial Revolution that helped lead to the growth of these things. You're going to see people like Mendeleev, right? Mendeleev being the Russian father of chemistry, who's going to discover the periodic laws in the periodic table, which leads to the analysis of atomic weight and the growth of modern day chemistry. And with modern day chemistry, you can later actually like use this idea to figure out how do we distillate that petroleum? How do we distill this actual rubber? How do we use what we know now chemically from Mendeleev to advance that second industrial revolution even further, right? And then later on, it would be subdivided as well into organic chemistry, which is the study of carbon life forms, industrial chemistry, like non-Newtonian chemistry, right? So the thing that you need to understand, though, is that Mendeleev gets that ball rolling, and he's like kind of one of the guys that serves as a reason why the Second Industrial Revolution could exist, because we're going to make more products using his ideas, right? And then you're going to also see this other guy named Michael Faraday, as I actually fixed this little thing, Michael Faraday, who comes up and he actually creates this thing known as the dynamo. All right, whoa, I forgot about this thing, right? So like Mendeleev is going to be very, very important as well, because his studies of chemistry are actually going to lead to the growth of new companies like throughout like the continent of Europe. One very famous one is known as Bayer, right? Some of y'all might have heard of Bayer before because they make Bayer aspirin, right? But it's actually short for Bayern, which is Bavaria, right? And so like they actually were the very first ones to take bark from a Japanese tree and distillate it into aspirin, right? Like so, and like aspirin, what is of course a chemical compound and used as a pain reliever, right? But without Mendeleev and the studies of chemistry, they never would have been able to advance into those fields, right? Now, Michael Faraday is an English inventor who's going to discover the base laws of electromagnetism, and he's going to create the very first dynamo. And a dynamo is actually going to be a thing to produce electrical energy by using a copper wheel and a magnet right here. And by running that copper wheel through that magnet, you cause the electrons, the valence electrons on the outside of the copper actual atom to wiggle a little bit, and when those electrons wiggle, they release electricity, right? Because they're releasing that energy due to their wiggling, right? And then you can actually create electricity now. Now you can run it through wires. Now you have electric streetcars. They're going to be inside of Haussmann-style cities, right? And so then last but not least, you're going to see the growth of new like companies and urbanized cities and stuff like that because of advents of the Second Industrial Revolution and guys like Mendeleev and Faraday. Good examples of this include the Krupp family, right? And the Krupp family is very well known for making the world's most famous weaponry at the time. The Krupp family was a German family that was on the forefront of creating artillery shells, large-style cannons, and then also on the forefront of the later on creating fully automatic weapons, right? Which will help lead into World War I. And then Manchester is going to become a very, very large manufacturing city due to the Second Industrial Revolution, so much so that Henry Ford actually put one of his main factories inside of the city of Manchester, England, right? But that right there is it. That is Unit 6 for you, okay? We'll see y'all soon. We'll talk about that test, and I'm also going to get that study guide, and I'm going to try and work on that Quizlet tomorrow and get that posted for you as well, okay? So I hope y'all had fun studying. I hope y'all are glad that we're done with this unit. I hate this unit so much. I'm glad it's behind us because the only things I really like to talk about are the poop in the streets and then also the houseman changes of cities, right? But we'll talk soon. Y'all have a good one.